Our speaker tonight, Deborah Thomas, received her PhD in Anthropology from New York University in 2000 and is currently professor, not 2000, yeah, 2000, yeah, and is currently professor of Anthropology and Africana Studies. She also holds a secondary appointment with the Graduate School of Education, and she is a member of the graduate groups in Africana Studies and English, and she came to us here at Penn from Duke University. She's the author of Exceptional Violence, Embodied Citizenship in Transnational Jamaica from 2011, Modern Blackness, Nationalism, Globalization, and Race, Transformations in the Cultural Production of Blackness from 2006. Thomas co-edited a special issue of the journal Identities titled Caribbeanist Anthropologies at the Crossroads from 2007 with Carla Slocum, as well as a special issue of Feminist Review called Gendering Diaspora 2008 with Tina M. Kempt. She's currently working on 2 projects that extend her interest in the afterlives of violence, particularly state violence, and we'll hear about some of that today. And as she considers the generative nature of violences in her work, she continuously explores what new forms of community, subjectivity, and expectation violence produces. Prior to her life as an academic, Deb was a professional dancer with the New York-based Urban Bushwomen, a company that is committed to using art as a means of addressing issues of social justice and encouraging civic engagement, and that brings the untold stories of disenfranchised people to light through dance from a woman-centered perspective and as members of the African diaspora community. Thomas has also been a program director with the National Council for Research on Women, an international working alliance of women's research and policy centers whose mission is to enhance the connections among research, policy, analysis, advocacy, and innovative programming on behalf of women and girls. She's done many other things, and I'm not going to tell you everything on her CV because it's just a really impressive range of activities and communities that she participates in. But I do want to highlight one of what I think is one of the truly distinguishing contributions of Deb's contribution to the academic community here at Penn, which is her interest in the variety of ways through which scholars might communicate their research to as wide an audience as possible, and her interest in the question of how different media formats provide distinct modes of thinking. She's exceptionally talented at fostering collaboration across institutional boundaries and is currently pioneering an initiative to bring together scholars from around Penn who participate in one way or another in the realm of visual and performative ethnography. Deb is also a filmmaker. She's the co-director and co-producer with John L. Jackson Jr. and Junior Gabu Wedderburn of the film Bad Friday, Rastafari After Coral Gardens, which is a documentary film that chronicles the history of violence in Jamaica through the eyes of the Rastafari community and shows how people use their recollections of the Coral Gardens incidents in 1963 to imagine new possibilities of the future. This film has shown at festivals and other venues all over the world, including South Africa, Brazil, and the UK, as well as in Jamaica itself. And one of the things that I think is really great about Deb is that she has often traveled with students from Penn to make them part of this international conversation around the film that she's produced. Deb is a consistently brave and clear thinker in the midst of the most complex places and difficult histories, something all of our Penn Humanities Forum Fellows have benefited from this year in our faculty and postdoc seminar, of which Deb is a part. It is not acceptable to her for us to simply document and narrate hitherto under-recognized histories of violence, for Deb insists that we must also consider how to respond to such histories in different and better ways. As she writes at the end of her exceptional book, Exceptional Violence, and I quote, "What is needed to generate real justice is a sustained conversation about history and about the place of the past in the present, in terms other than those of righteous blame or liberal guilt. This conversation must demand something more robust than memorialization, but it must also envision the future in new ways and on new terms. It must have something more profound than forgiveness at stake, for forgiveness, as it is generally imagined, is not reparative and is only sometimes restorative," end quote. If the humanities are worth defending, preserving, and developing, they will play a core role in this conversation, I think. Similarly, as Jim English and I planned our year-long meditation on violence through this public series, we felt that it was essential for our series to include multiple opportunities to consider what comes after violence and how, and what each of us might do to enable the production of dialogue, thought, reimagining, repair, hope, and peace. And there's no one better, we thought, to guide us in this conversation than Deb. I'm a true sucker for people who are bringers of change, and I feel really lucky in my life as a professor here to meet so many people like this in the extended community of the university and the city of Philadelphia. But among these people that I meet, I feel that Deb really stands out as somebody who is very special indeed, and it is my pleasure to welcome my colleague and my friend to the forum tonight. Please join me in welcoming Deb Thomas.
Hi, good evening. Wow, that's like the best introduction I've ever gotten. I'm gonna cry. Thank you so much for coming out tonight. Thank you to my fellow travelers in the Humanities Forum for giving me the opportunity to think through some new stuff that I've been working on and create some deadlines for myself, both within the forum and then today. I'm going to talk and share you stuff, and also have you listen to some interviews. And the title of the talk is "The Time of the Archive: Visual Anthropology and State Violence." So I want to think today about how time governs not only the appearance, but also the reception of archival statements. And more specifically, I want to talk about what narratives of moments of exceptional state violence produce, not only in terms of a sense of collectivity, but also in relation to the temporalities to which this collectivity is tethered. I'm interested, in other words, in what archives of these narratives can tell us about how we experience time, particularly vis-a-vis ideal notions of what legitimately constitutes our social and political worlds across generations and space. I want to explore these problems by thinking about two archives that I've been involved in producing visually. Both address instances of state violence. The first in 1963, which Karen told you about a little bit just now, now called the Coral Gardens Incident, though members of the affected community call it a crucifixion. And this was the basis of the 2011 documentary film that I made with John Jackson and Junior Wedderburn. The second instance is the state of emergency that was declared in West Kingston in May 2010 to enable the security forces to apprehend Christopher Dudus Koch, who had been ordered for extradition to stand trial in the United States on charges related to drugs and gun trafficking. This incursion, as it's euphemistically called, resulted in the death of at least 73 civilians, and it's the basis for Tivoli Stories, which is a multimedia installation that I'm working on with Junior again, and also psychologist Deanne Bell. In both cases, representing violence, and particularly state violence, audiovisually and publicly, has raised questions about the connections between space and time on one hand, and about the different truths that variously located members of a community are willing and able to acknowledge and examine on the other. It's this last issue that especially concerns me today, as the time of the archive is often rendered in posts, and by this I mean post-colonial, post-war, post-civil rights, post-socialist, post-9/11, and this postness suggests the dominance of a progressive, redemptive temporality, such as that which we might expect to emerge from a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. But what I want to do here is explore the possibility that nonlinear models of time give us stronger tools to think through the priors that always infuse presence, and therefore through the links between violent events as they are experienced and articulated by those suffering through them, and finally through the various levels of complicity that frame our engagements with these events. If we agree with Foucault's assertion that in its broadest imagination, an archive is first the law of what can be said, the system that governs the appearance of statements as unique events, then we must think about the process of producing archives as a space of potentiality, one that might catalyze new possibilities for seeing connections previously unexamined and for reordering our ontological taken for granted, such as space, time, and justice. Now, on to 1963. Rastas on rampage in Mobe, 8 persons killed. So screamed the headlines of Jamaica's daily afternoon paper, The Star, on the 11th of April, 1963. 2 days later, the Daily Gleaner led their news coverage with 4 articles under the heading, 8 killed after attack on gas station. 2 policemen, 3 Rastafarians among the dead. And by 10 a.m. on that fateful Holy Thursday morning, RJR, which is the first radio station in Jamaica, it's now called Radio Jamaica, reported the following. 3 people are now known to have died in this morning's uprising by Rastafarians in Montego Bay. For those who today understand Rastafarians as primarily advocating a philosophy of universalism, the one love Bob Marley sang about, and even for those who prefer to foreground Rastafari's ideological roots in Black supremacy and Pan-Africanism and its more general Black nationalist stance, news of a rampage or an uprising by Rastafarians would seem uncharacteristic. But during that immediate post-independence period in Jamaica, fear and disdain were the attitudes most commonly directed toward Rastafari, not only by those in the middle and upper classes, but also by many working-class Jamaicans. This means that events that were primarily local in scope generated national attention and concern. In this case, the high level of concern was marked by the fact that the Prime Minister at the time, Sir Alexander Bustamante, flew to Montego Bay, Jamaica's second city, accompanied by the Commissioner of Police, the top command of the Jamaica Defense Force, the security chief, 2 ministers of government, and several police from the headquarters in Kingston. Once in Montego Bay, Bustamante mobilized police forces from St. James, as well as those from the neighboring parishes of Hanover, Trelawney, and Westmoreland, to join with civilians in the roundup of Rastafarians. Ultimately, because of the actions of 5 bearded individuals, and this is what marked Rastafari for many at that time, dreadlocks don't become a real visual marker of Rastafari until really the 1970s. Because of the actions of 5 bearded individuals who were motivated by an ongoing land dispute, over 150 Rastafari were arrested, jailed, beaten, and tortured. In addition to 3 of those 5 who were involved in the attacks on the gas station, a nearby motel, and an estate manager's home, an unknown number of Rastafarians died as a result of these tortures, and many more were permanently scarred. Since the 1990s, a group of Rastafari in Western Jamaica has kept a public vigil commemorating this Bad Friday, and in 2007, this vigil was folded into the year-long schedule of events designated to commemorate the bicentenary of the abolition of the slave trade. At these commemorations, elder Rastafari offer testimony about their experiences, asking that the government make a formal apology to the Rasta community and that it consider reparations of some sort. I had first learned about the Coral Gardens incident as a graduate student 15 years earlier when I read the book by Terry Lacey called Violence and Politics in Jamaica, 1960 to 1970. Lacey discusses Coral Gardens briefly as one among several instances that provoked Jamaicans to believe that Rastafari as a whole were ready to violently revolt against the Jamaican state, thereby justifying an oppressive security policy. Wendell Bell and his student James Mao, Americanist sociologists who conducted research in Jamaica during the 1960s, also briefly mentioned the events that transpired near Coral Gardens in order to demonstrate that middle-class and upper-class Jamaicans have consistently viewed the Jamaican masses as hostile, menacing, and ready to revolt at any moment. Rex Nettleford treats the Coral Gardens events somewhat more substantially in his classic Mirror, Mirror, Identity, Race, and Protest in Jamaica, in order to show how Rasta became associated in the minds of the Jamaican middle-class public with crime and violence. He, like Lacey and Mao, argues that the state's response to the events at the gas station and beyond amounted to an overkill, resulting from, quote, a pathological fear of violence from particular sectors of the population. However, the official archive of what happened at Coral Gardens is slim. When I saw the notice in the newspaper about the 2007 commemoration and its links to the events regarding the bicentenary of the abolition of the slave trade, I then decided to see if I could get a more grassroots sense of what had happened to trigger the events at Coral Gardens and to find out more about the injustices that took place afterwards. I traveled down with my friend, Junior Wedderburn, a musician and Rastafarian from Portland, Jamaica, who migrated to the US some 27 years ago. Junior was the drummer for the dance company that I performed with in New York, and he now plays for the Lion King on Broadway. During the plane ride down, he confessed that though he and the elder Rastafari who mentored him were no strangers to harassment at the hands of the police and other agents of the state, he had never heard about Coral Gardens or about the suffering of the elders there in 1963. In part, he felt that this was the result of the particularly uneasy structural position of families like his when he was growing up. Working-class Black people throughout Jamaica who were reading or hearing about what happened at Coral Gardens would likely have felt sympathy for the Rosses, he argued, because of a sense that the government's actions were motivated, at least in part, by a desire to undermine the development of Black pride. However, because at the time Rasta and Black pride were so intertwined, and because Rasta was seen by people like his parents as a fearful thing, even though they themselves had been influenced in the development of their own Black consciousness and Black pride by movements like Marcus Garvey's, they would not have wanted to discuss the incident for fear of driving their own children toward Rastafari. We were both eager, therefore, to hear the stories, to try to find out what really happened on that bad Friday and to learn about what kinds of reparations were being envisioned. At the commemoration, we were fortunate to meet a few elders who were willing to talk with us about their experiences, and we listened with them to the testimonies of other elders on stage later that evening. The actual events of that Holy Thursday are not popularly known, and at the commemoration they're usually related merely as a way to introduce the main story of Coral Gardens, which is not the event, but the aftermath, the government roundup and criminalization of Rastafari. Elders' testimonies about their experiences of this aftermath tend to frame it as an epic war between the forces of good and evil. Here, it's not only the police, but also those civilians mobilized by police who become Roman soldiers, those representatives of a pagan society, indexed by Rastas as Babylon, who bullied Christians and thus were destined to fall. Like Christ, Rastafari are persecuted and betrayed by those they knew, subjected to extraordinary physical harm both directly and indirectly. The injustices done are rendered bureaucratic through the most inconsequential pedestrian resolutions, a fine levied here, a petty charge there. Nevertheless, at the annual commemoration, there are no victims among these elders, only resurrected soldiers. There, the elders' testimonies create an archive through which memory forges and instantiates the community's history and social relations, inspires younger Rastafari, solidifies the bonds of sociality within and between Rasta communities, strengthens elders' positions as revered ancients, and generates debate about future paths. The stories themselves become performances. Familiar phrasings are repeated, and the rhythmic crafting of particular cadences are punctuated by rhetorical flourishes. Rasta suffer bad, bad, they chant, and the public memorializing becomes a generative force. Rasta, they assert with pride, once persecuted and maligned, is now the symbol through which Jamaica is most recognized all across the world. Job persevered, and his fortunes were restored. When we attended this commemoration, I was in the middle of writing a book about violence. I felt it might be compelling to think through the Coral Gardens events as a way to discuss state violence against Rastafari in terms of its connections to more general patterns of political violence in Jamaica. Toward this end, I asked one of the elders if he would retrace his steps with me, to show me as we walked through the landscape what had exactly happened to him during the days following Holy Thursday of 1963. To my great surprise, he asked whether it wouldn't be more effective to do that on film. So, of course, I said, and thus began the odyssey of the documentary. Junior John and I set about tracking down elders with the help of the late Junior Aista J. Manning, Ross Simba from Trelawney, and others. We interviewed them on camera about how they came to the Rasta faith, what happened to them as a result of Coral Gardens, and how they envisioned justice. As we worked on Bad Friday, we developed written agreements both with the individuals we interviewed and with the broader bodies of Rastafari who had been involved in the struggle for intellectual copyright protection, among other things. We searched for archival footage of the era and for other experts who could speak about the long-term effects of the events at Coral Gardens, as well as more general efforts toward reparations. And on Friday, the 21st of April, 2011, the anniversary of Bad Friday, we previewed the film at the annual commemoration to a rapt audience. So I'm going to show you just a really short part of the what we call testimony section of the film.
I was working at Iron Shore, and I hear that they're coming on with Rasta. And I sit down there, and after what I see, some police and soldier and pavilion, they come through the cane piece was right there. And the whole of them come through, and then take me first. After I take the other brethren, and go to our next spot over that side and take our next one. You go Falmouth, but that jail couldn't hold me. And then carry go to Falmouth. And I stay at Falmouth Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, court. We got a court.
What did they charge you with?
Breach of the public law.
The Thursday morning, around 4 o'clock, I hear a rolling, coming very fast. And when it come up, I hear it stop, how it gate like here, so. And hear boop, 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 boop. And a board house. I mean, like we have a little keyhole, and me prep out, so. Me see soldiers like sand rain. You go back, Mr. Marcin, police and soldier out there, you know. When we have a little brother who lived before we. I realize, then lick down the door, and then go in and then start murder him and then drag him out.
Murder, Mr. Murder. The guy that murder me, man. All the woman with piece of chicken and all them kind of way that. And then they show down for me, I said, them meet me, beat me, to kill me. Stone, iron, everything they find. Yes.
What I do now, if it's here, Marcel now, I take off the mattress off of the bed, and I put it in the corner, and then go in the mattress, and I tie the mattress down here so, and I tie it up here so. And I hold the head, if the breeze can go in now. And so I get to save him from brutality with the big belly. Taking the Friday night, have the baby the Saturday night. Death road. But I say I'm not going to hospital because if it's a judgment, I not go. I stay there till the Almighty Jah help me and then take out the baby for me. See? I bleed till me white. White, like piece of white cloth. Then I have no blood in me. And at 7 days the baby live. 3 spoonfuls of tea, no breast until they die.
Since the 2011 commemoration, the documentary had its official premiere at the Bob Marley Museum in Kingston, and it's screened on college campuses across North America and the Caribbean, and at film festivals, community-based arts centers, and Rastafari gathering places internationally, including South Africa, as Karen mentioned, where we toured it for 3 weeks last summer with students and musicians. At our post-screening discussions, what comes up most often is that people, including Jamaicans and even including many Rastafari, didn't know about Coral Gardens, and that the film therefore brought to light an aspect of Jamaican history about which many, and especially a younger generation, had no idea. Indeed, one of the interesting conversations that's been generated at screenings where there have been a number of migrated Jamaicans in the audience has been an intergenerational one. For example, in Toronto, the screening was attended by several Jamaicans in their 60s who had migrated in the later 1960s to Canada, where their children and grandchildren were born. After the film, a number of these folks started talking about what they remembered of that time in 1963, and as their memories were jogged, their children looked on incredulously, wondering out loud how it is their parents wouldn't have passed along this information. Truth is, for migrants of a certain age, these kinds of stories don't tend to be the ones that they pass down to offspring interested in their Jamaican heritage. And so those in diaspora end up coming to Rastafari the way most people outside Jamaica do, which is through reggae music. This means that the depth of the history of persecution remains largely unknown. Since our primary agenda with the film was to create an awareness of this history, and through doing so support the community in their efforts toward reparations, we've been satisfied with that these sorts of intergenerational conversations have been fostered. In Jamaica as well, growing awareness about coral gardens has had a number of effects. For one, the film strengthened already existing efforts on the part of the community to petition the Office of the Public Defender to pursue a reparations case for survivors of coral gardens and their families. The public defender attended the commemoration where the film was screened in 2011, and later that summer, representatives from his office traveled to the western parishes to take sworn testimony from elders and witnesses, and they've also gathered corroborating evidence from the dusty boxes of records in police stations and jails. The Western Extension campus of the University of the West Indies in Montego Bay has recently also developed a digital archive of coral gardens that includes our interviews as well as testimonies from additional police and civilians who were part of or witnesses to the events of that week. There have also been a number of public lectures on the university campus in Kingston, and Prime Minister Portia Simpson addressed the international gathering of Rastafari students and scholars during the Rastafari Studies Conference last August that was organized to commemorate coral gardens. In other words, an event that was all but lost to public consciousness has, within the past 5 years, become part of the national imaginary. In part, this is because the position of Rastafari vis-a-vis the Jamaican state is much changed since the early 1960s. In the early years, Rastafari marked the limits of citizenship in independent Jamaica. They were seen as a threat to the consolidation of the new nation because they did not accept the authority of the Jamaican political leadership, instead seeing Africa as home. They did not subscribe to capitalist economic and social development models, and they attempted to turn the normalized hierarchies of color and class on their heads through both linguistic and ideological reconstruction. Now, Jamaica is known all over the world because of Rastafari and reggae music, and though some Rastafari maintain an opposition to political participation, newer organized groups have sought to create relationships with the state in order to advocate for their interests within the Jamaican polity via both local and transnational institutional fora. The scale of Rastafari's impact and critical intervention, therefore, both locally and transnationally, has intensified to the extent that elements of the community's language, worldview, and day-to-day practice have become part of the nation's performance of itself. Indeed, it's Rastafari that is largely responsible for the growth of Black pride and consciousness in Jamaica, especially among middle-class people, and that has put Jamaica on the map globally, particularly through the post-colonial world. The Coral Gardens Archive has also been able to capture sympathetic public attention because we are now 50 years on from the incident. Most of the police who were directly involved have either passed on or repented in one way or another. And while some of the families who were influential in the persecution of Rastafari in that area at the time are still active politically in the community, the general will of the population has changed. What I mean to say is that it's been possible to create this archive now and for it to have had such a broad and positive reception, because while the question of racial equality remains open-ended, significant transformations have occurred globally that no longer render Rastafari primarily as a threat to citizenship and nationalist integrity. This is not as obviously the case when we turn our lens to Tivoli Gardens. On the 24th of May, 2010, Jamaican police and military forces entered Tivoli Gardens in West Kingston. Under a state of emergency, the joint forces launched Operation King West in order to apprehend Christopher Dudas Coke, purported leader of the Shower Posse and Don of the community, again in order to fulfill the extradition order from the U.S. Department of Justice. By the end of the week, coke had not yet been found, and at least 73 civilians had been killed. And despite the immediate activities of various civil society organizations, such as Jamaicans for Justice and the Jamaican Civil Society Coalition, it took almost 3 years for the Office of the Public Defender to submit an interim report to Parliament regarding the conduct of the security forces. While the report calls for an inquiry that would hold accountable those responsible for the operation, community members still feel that their voices haven't been heard. This is the impetus for Tivoli Stories, a multimedia social memory project designed to provide a platform through which participating Tivoli Gardens and neighboring community members can recount their experiences during May 2010 and name and publicly memorialize the loved ones they've lost. Some of you who are here today have heard me talk about the narratives of the community members who've been working with us, and how these narratives tell us not only about what they experienced, which in some cases challenges official narratives about what happened, but also how what they experience provides windows into the everyday conditions of structural and symbolic violence that both lay the foundation for the periodic eruptions of exceptional violence and shape how people experience aftermaths or envision or evaluate alternative political futures. Today, I want to concern myself with what these narratives tell us about how people experience temporality. And what I want to focus on in particular is how narrations of the state of emergency always contain the sediments of what has happened before. And by invoking the way the past lives in the present here, I want to invite us to think beyond the causal dimension of structural historical analysis and notions of cyclical time. Instead, I want to argue that time during exceptional moments is experienced as out of joint, not just because it's multidirectional, nor merely because it reflects the multiple entanglements and palimpsests of events and experiences that, as they layer on top of each other, create the conditions for a haunting of the present. I want to suggest instead that we might explore an experience of time as simultaneous, with all times existing at once and potentially available for interpenetration. An approach to temporality that takes seriously the sense of simultaneity would rescue it from the hegemony of liberalism and its political teleologies of progressive time, and would untether it from the popular and scientific notions of evolution. It would also suggest that we should be more skeptical about narratives of perfectibility, like the one that I just mentioned, about how Rastafari has now become a more recognized and respected phenomenon within the Jamaican public sphere. Or like the ones that we hear in this country about Obama's election signifying some sort of post-racial utopia. Understanding the experience of time in exceptional moments as multiple and simultaneous instead encourages us to delve into the ways these sorts of archives can elucidate the various and messy entanglements at multiple levels of scale that social and political worlds. Of course, the context in which we're developing oral and visual archives with Tivoli Gardens community members is one that is still very much in the thick of things. On one hand, this is evident through the fairly clear parameters we've been given by community members themselves who are negotiating dual power structures, that of the state and that of the Koch family. There are parameters for what can and cannot be asked, and for what community residents should or should not say, or what we should edit out if they do, in order for everybody, including ourselves, to remain safe. On the other hand, the narratives themselves, both in content and in form, reflect the immediacy of the moment as well as its simultaneity with other moments. And this is the most obvious way that this happens is through narratives of personal loss. Nadine Sutherland, born in July 1968, moved from Maxfield Avenue at the age of 13 to live in Tivoli Gardens with her grandmother, where she's been ever since. The first question that we asked her was, what do you remember about the days surrounding the 24th of May, 2010? And here is her response.
I remember 2008, the 13th of January. I remember I was at 34 Sanctus Crescent, down my godmother's house, when I hear a lot of noise, and when I looked through the door, I saw a lot of soldiers coming back that direction. Couple hours about in 3:30 going to 4. I get a phone call and said 5 men died at Keith Avenue. But to my surprise, when I look, my son was in it at the age of 18-year-old, just graduated from the Denhamtown High School. I went to Kingston Public Hospital just to identify my son when the Jeep coming around with the 5 men. Just the shoes. I see he was having a Gap crepe and an Old Navy plaid blue short set and a sky blue Gansey. And I remember a lady turned to me and said, "Don't go over there, don't go over there." And I said, "But see my son there, see him there." She said, "Oh, you can identify a person by the feet alone." And I start describe the clothes and tell her, say, I'm having a chain around his neck. And I wouldn't mind if she could take it off for me. And she turned to me and said, all right, she will go and identify him for me. And when she looked, she said, yes, that's your son for true. Come back 2010, the 23rd and the 24th, I lose my two nephews.
Here, Nadine begins her story of the 2010, I think I turned me up instead of that. She begins her story of the 2010 state of emergency with her son's killing during an incident in 2008, weaving these two moments together not in the manner of providing background to current events, a causal progression from one to another, but instead in a way that suggests the compression of time, with all killings bleeding into each other, all becoming part of one immediate story. The extreme violence of the state's actions in 2010, and here I'm using Etienne Balibar's term to reference violence that destroys the conditions of political possibility. It produces a multiplicity in which the loss of Nadine's son and the loss of her nephews become simultaneous events. By this, I mean to suggest something different from the stories many psychologists would tell. For them, these senses of immediacy and urgency might reflect a trauma that's neither been fully processed nor buried, and therefore always prone to resurfacing in relation to new provocations. What I'm trying to get at here is that the kind of bare life that's produced through and within these moments suspends the possibility of linear time, and therefore opens alternative analytic spaces within which we more clearly see the entanglements that matter in the world. Perhaps this is something more easily conceptualized when we tie personal losses explicitly to systems of governance within garrison communities like Tivoli Gardens. Marjorie Williams, who had to stand by with her blind and bedridden father and her 13-year-old twin daughters as policemen took her 18 and 20-year-old sons out of her house, stood at the window listening as her sons were executed in the small garden plot to the side of the house next door. Immediately after the week of May 24th, Marjorie received a number of visitors.
Well, I had a lot of friends because I'm very well known in the area. And the MP of the area, he came and visit me, which is the Prime Minister, that was Mr. Bruce Collin. He came and looked for me, and along with other his colleagues, came there.
And this is a team that visited everyone.
All that lost loved ones and who were were bombed down and shoot up and stuff like that were mashed up because the member of the security force, they entered the house and they packed, ransacked and everything. But I was very, 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 very outreaching. They, you know, when they come to my house, I would just start going on behaving bad, and you know, and some of them were really. You don't hear that there was a bus out there to take decent abiding sentences. I couldn't leave my daddy and I couldn't leave my two daughters. Them, she said you should take out your two sons, and they were talking all kind of things. Well, you know.
What Marjorie's interlocutors are referring to here are the buses that were sent to the main roads bordering the community on the Sunday before the security forces entered Tivoli Gardens. All the radio and television stations issued broadcasts encouraging law-abiding citizens to leave the community on the buses, but many hesitated to do so. Not one person that we interviewed attempted to go on a bus. In part, this was because they said they didn't know where the buses were going or what they would need for the journey. And moreover, the stigma associated with leaving the community in such circumstances is strong. So on previous occasions when this kind of thing has happened, people have left or attempted to leave, and either as they're attempting to leave, and this did happen in 2010 also, they were being shot at by activists within the community. Or if they did leave, then their houses would be robbed while they're gone, sort of as a punishment for having abandoned the community. Additionally, several evoked the Green Bay Massacre in January 1978, when 14 political activists from another downtown community were promised employment and picked up in a van only to be ambushed by members of the Military Intelligence Unit, which is a covert branch of the Jamaica Defense Force. 5 of the men were shot dead and others scattered, but there's never been a thorough inquiry into the matter, and the PNP government in power at the time denied responsibility. In this case, the specter of the Green Bay Massacre existed in real time as people made decisions about whether to stay or leave. And this has to do with memory, no doubt, but I want to contend that it's also something less conscious than this. Marjorie's statement about being visited by the Member of Parliament for the community, who was also the Prime Minister, also evokes the entanglements of garrison politics and the relationships that have been produced between politicians and gangs, entanglements that have generated both ongoing wars between communities associated with rival political parties and occasional flagrant eruptions that, as in Nadine's case, tend to bleed into one. Several scholars have argued that systematic partisan gang violence tied to election periods only began with the 1967 elections and the state of emergency that preceded them. But others have asserted that politically oriented gang violence was born with the emergent trade unions in the mid-1930s, and indeed that the system of victimization and political violence was becoming a part of the political culture as early as 1938. Let us listen to Everton Morgan, a former soldier with the Jamaica Defense Force who was born in 1970 in Clarendon and moved to Tivoli Gardens in 1990 to be with his wife Claudette, as he explains what a garrison is.
A garrison community is a community that is
Can you hear this?
self-sufficient.
No.
In
How do I turn
most
it
way.
on?
It's everybody there think along the same line. They vote for the same party. They are, everybody mainly focus in the same direction. Everybody seems to agree with what goes on there, whether it's good or bad. And they basically have their own amenities there. Yeah, just like a city. I would compare a garrison to a city. Well, every garrison are affiliated to a political party, either the PNP or the JLP. And I tell you, the Member of Parliament, for which that garrison fall, would have close ties with the so-called leader of that garrison community, because the type of support that the politician gets from the community is dependent on how close the politician is with the leader there. So it is very important that the politician has a close tie with the leader of that garrison or any garrison.
What Everton is pointing to here is that the patron-client relationships, or is the patron-client relationships between elected political leaders and local dons. Because residents of garrison communities operate with a profound distrust of the police, and because the state has typically relinquished its responsibilities to persons living in garrisons, the dons or area leaders become the political authorities in the area. These dons not only mediate the links between formal and informal economic and political enterprise, but also perform state-like functions such as security, mediation of domestic and other disputes and determination of guilt and punishment, help with access to healthcare and education, and sponsorship of community events such as beauty pageants, children's Christmas treats, street dances, etc. This clientelism also extends to economic life, as politicians have typically granted contracts for development or maintenance work to leaders within the garrison communities with the expectation that the leader would use his influence to bring people to work on the contract, thereby strengthening both his and the politician's influence. In this sort of scenario, dons provide votes while politicians provide, on one hand, the means to an income, and on the other, protection for involvement in political activism and/or illicit import and export trades. This has led several scholars to postulate that garrisons actually constitute parallel states, yet Everton's perspective on this relationship is more nuanced.
Tivoli going to be always be known as the flagship committee for the Jamaica Labour Party. That will never change. Maybe the talk is not as loud as it used to be in terms of that, but it still goes on. The whole political influence, yes, the Don or the community leader would want to do his own thing to make sure that he's strong financially, but he still needs the support of the Member of Parliament to work closely with him to do what he has to do.
These extremely careful and opaque remarks evoke another set of entanglements having to do with the various permutations of first growing and trading ganja and later the international trafficking in cocaine and arms. Ironically, it's ultimately this set of entanglements that actually links the two archives together. It's well known that ganja was imported to Jamaica from India, and that this importation dates from the beginning of Indian indentureship throughout the British Caribbean, so after the abolition of slavery, a few years after 1845 to the end of the First World War, 1917. The use of ganja was primarily a working class phenomenon and so went largely ignored by the colonial government, despite the fact that in 1924, Britain acceded to the Egyptian delegation's request at a meeting of the League of Nations to place ganja on the list of dangerous drugs to be regulated. After this conference, the British colonial government allowed medicinal and scientific uses of Indian hemp, but forbade non-medical use, production, or trade. This law remained generally unenforced until the West Indies-wide riots in the late 1930s, when planters began to link industrial resistance, ganja, and Rastafari, who, despite not being part of the trade unions, nevertheless played a role in the strikes, and this was a fact that was well known to colonial authorities. At that point, an amendment was made in 1941 to the already existing dangerous drugs law that incorporated mandatory imprisonment. Ironically, it's at this very moment that some Rastafari allege that ganja was being cultivated and exported from Pinnacle, the first Rastafari compound, 500 acres of land near Slagaville in St. Catherine, and established in the late 1930s. What they have said, but what I have not yet been able to substantiate, is that Leonard Howell, the leader of the Pinnacle compound, was working with Alexander Bustamante, at the time Chief Minister and leader of the Jamaica Labour Party, to facilitate the export of ganja to British troops throughout World War II. If true, this would stand as one of the ironic entanglements produced by the illicit trade, since Bustamante's government was no friend to Rastafari, invading Pinnacle on a number of occasions until its final destruction in 1954. The allegation of a link between Rastafari, the Jamaican government, the colonial government, and the trade in ganja may, of course, be myth. But even as myth, however, it signifies something about the strength of the belief that members of the elected political and anti-colonial leadership have maintained relationships with representatives of the colonial state that have ultimately been detrimental to the broader population, and, moreover, that they have had a hand in illicit trade since the very beginnings of the establishment of the democratic nationalist state. The implications of this belief are far-reaching, but for now, let us return to the story about ganja. The dispersal of Rastafari after 1954, primarily to Kingston, enabled a small trade to flourish during the 1950s and 60s, and many small farmers supplemented their income by cultivating ganja, especially after bauxite mining dispossessed many in rural areas from their lands. After Coral Gardens in 1963, the dangerous drugs law was again changed to include a mandatory minimum sentence of 18 months. For several observers, this change had long-term devastating effects on the population as a whole, as it provided the pretense for representatives of the government to round up persons of interest with no explicit warrant, thereby facilitating the corruption of the police force. With the new law spurring police raids, the ganja trade entered the realm of criminal activities, and a new stratum of dealers emerged who forged relationships in the US to supply the market there. By 1974, ganja became the #1 export from Jamaica, with 2 million pounds smuggled into the US in that year alone, generating upwards of $400 million. Accompanying these changes was the emergence of a gun trade, which also coincided with intensified migration to Kingston and the emergence of the rude boy phenomenon, with gangs battling for control of new areas within the shanty towns of West Kingston. Both Michael Manley's government, elected in 1972 on a platform of Beta Must Come, which was eventually articulated as a democratic socialist vision, and Edward Seaga's 1980 government, elected on the platform of deliverance from socialism, resulted in intensified gun violence and the subsequent extension of US power in Jamaica through the DEA and other paramilitary units. After Seaga's election, the government embarked on a massive ganja eradication campaign, one that forced many dealers and exporters into other, more lucrative substances like cocaine, which ultimately generated incredible wealth for those at the center of the trade, therefore also shifting the balance of power in the relationship between the politicians and the dons. Today, the language of America's counter-narcotic strategy is one of security rather than substance abuse. And this change was signaled most clearly in the establishment of the Caribbean Basin Security Initiative, inaugurated in April 2009 at the Summit of the Americas. There, President Obama requested the allocation of nearly $73 million for both military and economic aid, with approximately 75% of this amount going toward the former. In other words, the militarization of security would receive the lion's share of the US funding, while the economic and social dimensions of security would remain significantly less elaborated. This sort of policy focus leads to ongoing complaints among Caribbean political leaders that the US government does not seem sufficiently inclined to appreciate the links between security and economic development, and more broadly, that this is just the latest form of neo-imperial interventionism throughout the region. Indeed, US involvement is the reason most community members cite for why the 2010 government foray into Tivoli Gardens was different from earlier ones, and particularly those in 1997 and 2001, when security forces were engaged in days-long gun battles from which they ultimately had to retreat. In other words, their sense of why the security forces were able to penetrate further into the community in 2010 than ever before was that the order had come from the US government, and the Jamaican government couldn't stand up to that. And so it was people's perceptions of this particular entanglement that shaped how they responded in 2010 to Prime Minister Bruce Golding's decision to sign the extradition order for Christopher Coke. Consider the following remarks from Chinaman, himself a well-respected youth within the community who lost a little brother during the state of emergency. We asked him to talk about what the response was in West Kingston when people learned of the extradition order.
Respond. People let me traumatize before them even come in. As they hear about this extradition thing. Because them remember back from back in the days with evil Jim Brown. And people, if you know say them are going to extradite Dodos, the people them hero. The people are going to feel away. people are going to start priests right now. So all of them treat, they are going to stop keep for them youth, you know. The youth, them not going to get no more bag, them not going to get no more book. Youth, them not going to get no proper schooling again. Because them take a man who do so much good for the community. And for him now out of the picture, it's like things will never be the same.
Did you understand what he was saying at all? Yeah. Okay, so I mean, this is the sort of most patois of the things that I've played for you today. Basically, what he's saying is that when people learned that Golding had signed the extradition order, which he took 9 months to do, by the way, big scandal erupted around that too. But they immediately thought about his father, Jim Brown, who also was imprisoned in order to be extradited to the U.S. on charges, again, related to the drug trade. And that immediately they realized that without this leader in their community, everything that they had come to be able to expect or to enjoy, like school fees for their kids, jobs, events in the community, other forms of stability and safety, really, and justice also would disappear, right? And that the community would be in chaos. And actually, this is something also that WikiLeaks unearthed in cables back and forth with the U.S. Embassy, was U.S. representatives in Jamaica cabling, though it's not really cable anymore, but with people in Washington saying that if they extradite Duras, there will be chaos in downtown Kingston. So the priors that Chinaman evokes here have to do with the lineage of Dons, or these area leaders within West Kingston. And this is a lineage that begins with Zaki, who was the first notable top-ranking to be affiliated with the Jamaica Labour Party, and who was killed in the political violence surrounding the 1967 elections. After Zaki, his 18-year-old mentee, Claudie Massop, took over the leadership of Tivoli Gardens. Massop was one of two principals in the peace treaty that was inspired in part by the Green Bay Massacre, which was designed to short-circuit the political civil war between Tivoli Gardens and nearby PNP-affiliated communities. Massop was shot dead by police in February 1979 on his way home from a football match in Spanish Town. After Massop, the Donship went to his first deputy, Carl Mitchell, who died less than a year later from a drug overdose, and then to Lester Coke, otherwise known as Jim Brown, and that's who Chinaman is talking about. Lester Coke, along with Vivian Blake, presided over the community throughout the 1980s during the massive expansion of the cocaine trade into Jamaica, and they were both under the watchful eyes of the U.S. Department of Justice and the DEA. Coke was arrested in 1991 and died from a mysterious fire in his cell while awaiting extradition on the same day that his son, Jati, another leader of what had by then become known as the Shower Posse, was killed. At this point, Coke's outside son, Christopher Duras Coke, took over the reins of the community at age 21. After an initial purge of competitors for the throne, Duras ushered in the most peaceful and crime-free period in West Kingston's history. The extradition order, therefore, not only evoked a simultaneity, the strange circumstances surrounding his father's death, but as Chinaman notes, also threatened people's livelihoods and the relative peace they had enjoyed for close to 20 years. I've wanted to demonstrate that narratives of experiences during moments of extreme state violence expose entanglements not as context or history or background, but as producing and existing in alternative temporal realities, something about which scholars across disciplines have recently been concerned. Of course, as an anthropologist, I would be remiss if I didn't point out that we have numerous examples across the ethnographic record of people who live through and within temporal frameworks that differ from normative Western conceptualizations of linear time. Several groups within Indonesia, for example, understand temporality in terms of the co-occurrence of multiple cycles of time, which, as Tom Belstorff has pointed out, quote, do not count the duration of time so much as classify time into genres of conjunctural meaning, end quote. Indeed, as Clifford Geertz has written, Balinese calendars, quote, don't tell you what time it is, they tell you what kind of time it is. Yet what I've been exploring here is not the everyday lived multiplicity of time, but the sense of multiplicity and simultaneity produced by extreme moments. This is more akin to the non-unitary versions of temporality studied by neurologists like David Eagleman, or the notions of imaginary time produced by physicists like Stephen Hawking. By teasing out some of the ways people narrate their experiences during moments of extraordinary state violence, I've been trying to make sense of how each archive reflects different political temporalities, different vantage points of possibility, while nevertheless also remaining connected. The Bad Friday archive tells an immediately post-colonial story, and the rendering of the archive conforms to progressive conceptions of time, replete with the liberal acknowledgement that human rights were violated and justice is due. This certainty regarding justice and faith in liberal constructions of citizenship is not readily extended in today's Jamaica to the Tivoli Gardens case, because a majority of people, despite publicly aired concerns regarding extrajudicial violence, cannot now see residents of garrison communities, just as people in the 1960s could not see Rastas, as anything other than a fundamental threat to the consolidation of the neoliberal state. To a degree, the difference between the two archives lies in the extent to which there is generational distance from the project each community of sufferers represents. The Black and Pan-African consciousness of Rastafari is no longer seen as a threat to the consolidation of a legitimate multiracial state. Garrison communities, on the other hand, still represent a threat not only to nationalist consolidation, but also to peace and security locally and transnationally. This is partly because, unlike Rastafari, their entanglements with the legitimately institutionalized system of political representation and economic development are so entrenched, a fact that in the main remains a public secret. But there's something more to the differences between these two archives. In a way, we might think about Rastafari as having become routinized in Jamaica, which would mark the end of a particular version of revolutionary possibility throughout the region. This is an issue with which David Scott has long been concerned, and he has addressed it eloquently in his recent analysis of temporality vis-à-vis the collapse of the Grenada Revolution. Scott's argument here is that temporal disjunctures live on in the aftermaths of political catastrophe, and that these disjunctures dislodge what had previously been, for the revolutionary generation, a taken-for-granted relationship between history and time. No longer is time experienced as linear and redemptive, itself, as many have noted, a product of liberal modernity, where more perfect futures are brought into being through the realization of a political project that will, ironically, mark the end of history. Instead, in the wake of revolutionary failure, that generation experiences time traumatically as stalled in the present, as a cyclical loop without the expectation of change. For them, as Scott writes, the past is a wound that will not heal. The new hegemony of neoliberalism, however, has produced a post-revolutionary generation that is less enmeshed in the liberal temporalities that organized political time before them, and therefore more immune to the sense of vulnerable longing that characterizes their parents' sense of time. This means that their histories of the present are disconnected, as Scott writes, from the temporal structure of revolutionary desire. And they can blast open new futures because they're able to act in the present, unfettered by the expectations of a global left and politics of non-alignment. If we were to think about the 2010 state of emergency as a kind of revolution, it would be one to end politics as usual, which means, of course, to upend the foundations upon which liberal democratic nationalism was built in Jamaica. This revolution, however, was not forged within the teleological framework of futures from pasts, and so did not comprehensively destroy the foundations it set out to challenge, nor propose an alternative. Indeed, in many ways, the revolution was a necessary response to one that had already happened, as the scaffolding of patron clientelism had already been significantly bent by Dodas himself, who more than any other Don before him operated independently of politicians, united Dons across Jamaica and transnationally, and even in some cases across political parties, and created opportunities within private enterprise for himself and others. This is decidedly not the revolution imagined by mid to late 20th century leftists, but nonetheless may have the same effect in terms of delegitimizing the state. And it requires, as other revolutionary moments also do, what anthropologist Melissa Rosario calls a radical openness to the future, even as it is underwritten by a powerful sense of uncertainty. Rosario is writing about the affective dimensions of contemporary social movements in Puerto Rico, and theorizes the ethnographic work that she's done with environmental activists and with the student strikers who shut down the University of Puerto Rico in 2010 and 2011 as forms of unfinished radical praxis, themselves the goals of what she calls revolutionary time. While the contexts within which we're working are considerably different, the notion of time that undergirds Rosario's approach approximates what I'm trying to get at today. Both the archives I've talked about call into question what citizenship has meant in post-independence Jamaica and tell us something about how it's been constituted over time. They also situate the meaning of belonging to the specific nation-state within the messy context of transnational circulation, of people, of worldviews, and of informal economic industries, as well as the global institutional framework that sustains them. Placing these events alongside each other, as happened in real time during a recent Coral Gardens protest march at which participants did make the link between what happened in 1963 and what happened in 2010. Putting these events alongside each other stymies the impetus toward what Alan Feldman would call a cathartic break with the past, establishing the pastness of prior violence and managing and controlling the conditions and terms of its periodic reentry into the present. Instead, it urges us to look at the connections among moments of extreme violence, to look for the priors coexisting with presents across contexts. Here, the temporal multiplicity generated by extreme state violence dislodges progress narratives and lays bare both the exclusions perpetuated through liberal rule and the strategies through which these exclusions are produced and reproduced. In this case, the international trades in drugs and arms, patron-clientelistic political relations, corruption, and racially motivated disenfranchisement. It forces us to ask, what are we willing to sacrifice in order to create different futures? And it forces us to reckon with the impossibility of tying the elaboration of a future to our present intentions. Thank you.
I wonder if you could just say, you made an interesting comment about the post-revolutionary, what you call the post-revolutionary generation's ability to act in the present. You invoked Rosario's notion of kind of this radical openness to the future, but you also talked about kind of what seemed to me like a deep memory of sort of violence in the past, maybe the repetitive nature of that violence. So I just wondered if you could talk about a little bit more about the conditions of possibility of that post-revolutionary generation's ability to act in the present, if that has something to do with memory, or if it's something that's more kind of proleptic, kind of based on this radical openness to the future.
Yeah, thanks. That's a good question. I think it actually has something to do with the eradication of memory. You know, it's interesting because David's work has long really, to me, been suffused with this real sense of anguish, you know, and post-possibility nostalgia in a way that is characteristic to me of many in his generation, especially of Caribbean radical thinkers and actors. This sense of like, where did we go wrong? You know, Grenada really for them marked the end of a set of possibilities for a different organization of the world. It was definitely the end of the left in the Caribbean. So this is, you know, 84, so he's, what, almost 60, not quite. Melissa is, you know, 20-something, 30, I suppose, and embodies, I think, a very different generational relationship to imagining a different future. It's not your parents' revolution, you know, it's not that kind of project where there's a goal at the end, and we know what it's supposed to look like. And again, once it's achieved, then that's it. There's no need for history anymore. You know, we've reached we've reached the summit. And I think for her and her generation, when they're looking at politics, actually existing politics in the world, it's the stuff that older generation kind of mocks, all of this stuff with Occupy, right? Because they don't see it as doing anything, because their orientation toward revolutionary time is about attaining something, something more than what is here. And I think for people like Melissa and the people who she works with, politics is really about the ongoing doing, and it's about imagining a horizontal framework of conviviality, rather than a new and different kind of state. So that's sort of what I see as the difference. And it's hard for these two perspectives to talk to each other, I think, productively, because it marks such a different organization of time and space, and a real different notion of radical action. I mean, I think people in David's generation would say that, a younger, there is no, younger people don't have any conceptualization of what's possible in terms of politics, because the hegemony of neoliberalism has erased or sanitized the memory of any of those radical actions in the past, which is true. The people in Grenada aren't taught about the revolution, and if they're taught about the revolution, it's so sanitized because the kind of anti-communism has become just normalized, Similarly, in Jamaica, though, there's always still been a more radical strand, I think, because of Rastafari and other kinds of movements like that. So I'm not entirely sure I've answered your question, but I think there's a real generational disconnect in terms of how do you envision time, how do you envision possibility, how do you envision a future, and what are the processes by which we get there, politically.
I wanted to ask you about media time and how that contributes to your thinking process, and I'm interested in both the difference between the temporality offered by the audio files versus the audio-visual files, and what the difference is there when you add in images and also add in subtitles. And as an extension of that question, I'm wondering whether recorded media, or how recorded media makes space for the future. It seems that always the past and the present is in crisis in recorded media, and I'm always thinking about is it possible to have a future in this, and how does that happen?
Yeah, and what does it look like? How do we represent it? Yeah, that's the next essay. I'm thinking about it, but haven't been able to sort of crystallize a good theoretical purchase on it as yet. The film, the way that we edited the film, the way that we chose to deal with language, all of that had to do with what we decided about our audience, really. And so once we decided that the primary audience for that film was the community itself, then it structured how much background we gave, which aspects of the story were featured. We knew people would want to see themselves and hear their own testimonies. We didn't want to have a lot of kind of expert knowledge explaining things. We wanted to have people theorize their own situations. But we also knew that the kind of secondary audience was this international human rights group, and that they wouldn't understand nearly a word that many of the elder Rastafari were seeing. So we decided we needed to have subtitles, and this was like a fraught decision, Today I didn't put any visuals with the audio recording, and that's partly because this is being recorded, and as I said, things are still very much in flux, and very much in the middle of things. And a couple weeks ago when we were there and talking with a number of people in the community and also people in civil society organizations, we all kind of decided that we wouldn't we wouldn't come out with anything publicly until the Commission of Inquiry was underway, which was supposed to have happened last year, August, July, really, but hopefully will happen in May. And so, you know, people agreed to come, they agreed to talk, they agreed to sign their name to things. So I'm using real names, but I just decided I didn't think it would be right to use the images right now in a public forum. But I think, too, that how we engage the sound without the images is actually, or I have found anyway, one of the things that I have found talking about this and showing or screening bits of it to people is that when there is a visual, it's a complete distraction, you know, to what people are actually experiencing from the narratives. And so I think I talked a little about in the forum about how we're trying to deal with that visually also. But sometimes I like to just see, you know, how people respond just to the oral testimonies. But in terms of media time, it's something I'm still thinking about, really. And you can be sure I will be knocking on your door to have conversations about it.
Hi, Deb. Thanks for that terrific talk. I have a question about the tense structure of the interlocutors in...
the what structure?
Tense, linguistic tense, so past,
tense.
present, tense, past, I have a halls in my mouth,
Okay.
sorry. Past, present, future. So, I mean, clearly, for the film and for this, the second project, for the film, clearly you engaged in translation. And one of the things that struck me about the footage in the film, and as we were listening to the narration, I wrote down the tense structure, and in many cases, probably about 10, there were 10 different sentences that were in the present, and they were translated as the past because they were meant to be past. But I wonder if that's not a wonderful example of temporality there, but actually not exceptional, but the mundane. So I know that you did a lot of the translation, so you know the sort of thing that I'm talking about, but you chose not to incorporate that in the way that you're thinking about it. And I wonder if you could comment on that in relation to temporality. Is there something about the delivery and the use of the present to talk about the past, the present, and the future that's particular to patois, that's particular to the ways that people understand in the everyday the relationship between that past, present, and future, and might that be another way to further build on the provocation that you've given us really in thinking through this? And I think you've made a compelling case, and whether or not this would even further adumbrate that argument.
Yeah. That's a great point. And I think that will be a very fruitful thing to think about vis-a-vis those narratives, also because it ends up challenging some of the kind of linear temporality with which people receive the film, for example. And yeah, it's not exceptional to them narrating these stories. As you know, patois is like basically a present tense thing. So even as people are talking about the past and talking about the next, it's often articulated in the language of now. So I think that's actually going to be a really interesting thing to think about more. Thank you for that.
Thanks a lot for a fascinating talk. I wonder if you could say a little more about how you see the mode of recollection and kind of simultaneity, the recollection of a simultaneity or the production of a temporality that contains the past and future and multiple pasts. How you see that generating a new kind of political conception. And I think that's what you were saying towards the end, and that was the first question. Just to state it again, you know, what going through these moments and experiencing them as though they still are happening, what kind of political consciousness that generates, either for the people who are recounting them or for the people who are encountering these texts. the ones that you're producing. And I'm wondering, too, if there's anything to say about the title, Archiving State Violence, and just the fact that in histories of the formation of the state, there's often a similar temporality that's talked about. The French Revolution is reimagining Greece and Rome and going through a kind of simultaneity, not of the victims of the state, but of the people installing the state. And there's a similar kind of detemporalization in the festivals surrounding the revolutionary formation of a new state and of the new liberal state. So I'm wondering if there's something about the state itself, regardless of which side, whether it's in creating the violence or if it's people receiving the violence, in its capacity to produce these zones of exception that generates this atemporality. And if we want to think outside the state form, we maybe need to think outside of that atemporality as well.
Yeah, another really good point. Thank you for that. In terms of what kinds of politics are possible, I'm unable to define that at the moment because, unlike my usual position, which would be that we can always see alternative possibilities, or we can always sort of get a glimpse of something else that could be imagined, it's actually very difficult to, in this case, there doesn't seem to be a clear or even a murky vision of how something else might come into being within the community. People's, very thoughtful people's assessments of the scenario is that it will never change. And that they need the dawn, they need the strength of a dawn, otherwise everybody is just fighting each other, So there's, I think, and because the state's solution to the evacuation of leadership now is to have removed every other possibility within the community. So there used to be a weekly dance that people from all over Kingston attended, and really people from all over the world who were into the dance hall scene, always a big Japanese contingent at that street dance. That's done. That's not happening anymore. Things are basically locked down by 8 o'clock at night. Curfew. There was a curfew actually 2 weeks ago that had been imposed. And if people aren't outsiders, if they're not coming into the community, that means no income is coming into the community. So that really, it's through the kind of entertainment industry that people were able to make something of themselves, meet people outside the community, sell CDs or music or whatever. So without that, there's like no avenue for self-actualization, I suppose, for lack of a better term. And people don't have a sense of a political alternative. Outside the community, right after this happened, there was a lot of noise about, we have to end garrison politics and such, but the will behind that collapsed. And after the public defender released an interim report, there was again a bit of an upsurge of sort of movement on thinking through how do we expose these political circumstances, and that's kind of gone underground now too. I imagine if they in fact get an inquiry going, it might come back into consciousness. But it's really difficult to imagine what that future is because no one seems willing to actually hold accountable anyone other than the leaders within the community. And everybody knows about politicians who have ganja fields, people who have waited in Miami customs for shipments of cocaine, prominent persons within Jamaica, but no one is willing to expose that or expose them right now. So I'm being much more pessimistic than usual because it's really difficult to see what this experience of time might produce. And I'm hoping that as things move along and an inquiry gets going, I'll be able to see more, that there is a vision, or there are multiple visions of possible alternatives.